Good afternoon. You're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where SpaceX is counting down to liftoff of a Falcon Heavy rocket at 5:56 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 22:56 UTC for those of you watching around the world, about an hour and 10 minutes from now. This mission will mark the fifth flight of a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket, dating back to the famous inaugural test flight that carried one of Elon Musk's Tesla Roadsters into heliocentric orbit. That was back on February of 2018. 3 additional Falcon Heavy rockets have launched since then. Today is Flight 5 for SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, one of the most powerful rockets in the world and the most powerful commercial rocket anywhere in the world that is currently operational. This mission is for the U.S. Space Force. It's named USSF-67. And on board the Falcon Heavy out at Pad 39A are 2 U.S. Space Force satellites. One is a military communications spacecraft. The other hosts a number of tech demo and prototype experiments that will be infused in the future into operational military programs. The view you're looking at live right now from Launch Complex 39A is provided to us by SpaceX. It's one of SpaceX's cameras. We're not controlling this particular view. It's an up-close shot of the Falcon Heavy, the strong back vertical up next to the vehicle. The Falcon Heavy stands 229 feet tall. It's about 70 meters in height. And with the 3 Falcon booster cores strapped together, that rocket has a width of about 40 feet or 12.2 meters. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now, and I'll be providing commentary throughout the SpaceX countdown this afternoon as the company targets liftoff at 5:56 p.m. Eastern Time, 22:56 UTC, just about 10 minutes or so after sunset on Florida's Space Coast. And with clear skies, this should be a spectacular launch visible up and down the Florida Peninsula, with the Falcon Heavy climbing into sunlight just a few moments after liftoff, and we expect to see the engine plume from the 27 engines of the Falcon Heavy illuminated against a darker sky as the Falcon Heavy makes its way into space, heading due east from Kennedy Space Center. If you haven't done so yet, we ask you to please hit the like button. That's the thumbs up button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this spectacular twilight launch to as many people as possible. And to help us do that, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. SpaceX's countdown now is passing T-minus 1 hour, 7 minutes. There's a 37-minute launch window available tonight that opens at 5:56 p.m. and runs until 6:33 p.m. Eastern Time. The launch had been scheduled for yesterday or Saturday around the same time, but SpaceX yesterday afternoon announced that the launch will be delayed 24 hours. That's because preparations for the mission ran a little bit behind schedule late in the week and into Saturday. The rocket was not lifted vertical on the pad until shortly after noon, around 1 p.m. local time yesterday, just about 5 hours before the opening of the launch window. And SpaceX typically needs longer than that, often 8+ hours before the launch window is when the Falcon rocket needs to be vertical for SpaceX technicians to perform final checkouts and ready the rocket for the countdown, which will get underway in earnest coming up in the next few minutes with the loading of propellants onto the Falcon Heavy rocket. The loading of kerosene and liquid oxygen is expected to begin at T-minus 50 minutes, beginning with kerosene, and at T-minus 45 minutes with the cryogenic oxidizer. T-minus 1 hour, 3 minutes, 21 seconds, and counting. We're about 10 minutes away from the expected time we should hear from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch readiness poll is complete. Members of the Falcon Heavy launch team are working out of Firing Room 4 of the Launch Control Center, which is just outside the Vehicle Assembly Building at Kennedy Space Center, about 3 miles from Launch Complex 39A. And that's where engineers and managers are gathered from SpaceX as well as the customer, the U.S. Space Force, to monitor this afternoon's countdown operation. We want to thank Space Pony for gifting memberships to our viewers. We really appreciate that support. You can support our coverage by contributing in the Super Chat here on YouTube. You can also become a member. Click the Join button on our YouTube channel. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from depending on which level you choose. You can get access to exclusive members-only video features from our launch coverage on Florida Space Coast and around the world. The official launch weather forecast this evening calls for a better than 90% chance of favorable conditions locally at Kennedy Space Center for the launch. There is some uncertainty about the sea conditions downrange. One of SpaceX's recovery ships is stationed about 1,000 miles east of Kennedy Space Center out in the Atlantic Ocean to retrieve the 2 payload fairing halves from the top of the Falcon Heavy. Once they jettison off the rocket, they'll parachute into the Atlantic Ocean. And there are some rough seas out in the Atlantic this evening. But we're not sure and haven't heard any indication from SpaceX that that will be a constraint for launch tonight. The 2 side boosters will be returning to Cape Canaveral Space Force Station 8 minutes after launch. So those boosters will be coming back to the launch site, landing on about 9 miles south of the launch pad itself. So no drone ship to worry about tonight out in the ocean, so no issue there. And the weather, as I mentioned up front at the start of our broadcast, the weather conditions at Kennedy Space Center are near ideal for launch this evening. T-minus 58 minutes, 30 seconds. Now 5.5 minutes away from the expected time of the conclusion of the launch readiness poll that will give the go or no-go to proceed into propellant loading on the Falcon Heavy rocket this evening for its twilight launch, scheduled for 5:56 p.m. Eastern Time, 22:56 UTC. T-minus 55 minutes, 13 seconds and counting. The Falcon Heavy rocket out on pad 39A will be powered off of the planet by 27 Merlin 1D engines. You see those engines here in this photo from SpaceX taken a little more than a week ago during final preparations for the launch. This is a picture of the Falcon Heavy's 3 Falcon booster cores bolted together inside the hangar at pad 39A. These 27 kerosene-fueled engines will generate about 5.1 million pounds of thrust at full throttle at liftoff. The center core stage of the Falcon Heavy will actually throttle down shortly after launch to a partial thrust mode to conserve propellant, because that engine, or that booster, that center booster, needs to burn about 4 minutes on this evening's flight. Typically, the Falcon 9 boosters burn about 2.5 minutes on the way up to space. So that center core will throttle down to save some fuel to burn longer during tonight's flight, while the 2 side boosters will power at full throttle. Those 2 side boosters will burn about 2 minutes and 24 seconds before shutting down their engines and separating. They'll peel away from the core stage, and then actually they'll reignite a subset of their engines, 3 engines, for boost back burns, each of them, to begin powering themselves back toward Cape Canaveral for landing. Those 2 side boosters will land at landing zone 1 and 2, about 9 miles or 15 kilometers south of pad 39A, 8 minutes after liftoff. The center core stage, after it separates from the Falcon Heavy upper stage, around 4 minutes into the flight, will actually fall back into the atmosphere and will not be recovered. SpaceX will not make an attempt to recover the center core stage on tonight's flight. It'll dedicate and use all of its propellant to delivering the 2 U.S. Space Force payloads to their high-altitude orbit. The upper stage will actually do the final maneuvers to place these 2 payloads into geosynchronous orbit.
Polling is complete.
It'll take about 6 hours for the upper stage to complete what we expect to be 3 different burns to place the payloads into geosynchronous orbit more than 22,000 miles, about 36,000 kilometers over the equator. We just heard a confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the team is go for propellant loading and launch, a good sign, as we're now 52 minutes 30 seconds away from liftoff. Propellant loading will begin at 50 minutes before launch.
Countdown, a reminder on abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold, hold, hold on the countdown net. Launch control abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed to the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count. Here in firing room 4, in the event of a fire alarm, key operators noted below in the procedure will remain at their post while the alarm is evaluated. In the event that personal safety is threatened, we will evacuate to the south-facing emergency exit, which leads directly outside.
That was the voice from SpaceX Launch Control, briefing the launch team on their final procedures, the procedures they'll need to follow during the terminal countdown in the event of any abort or emergency. But everything looking good now. The countdown has passed T-minus 50 minutes.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And we just heard the call that launch auto sequence has started. So kerosene fuel, called Rocket Propellant 1, is now flowing into the 3 Falcon Heavy booster cores at pad 39A. This is the first step of propellant loading this evening. This will be followed at T-minus 45 minutes with the start of liquid oxygen loading on the 3 Falcon Heavy first stage booster cores. And then at T-minus 35 minutes, loading of propellant on the upper stage will get underway. SpaceX's countdown now approaching T-minus 45 minutes. And at that point, liquid oxygen should begin flowing onto the 3 Falcon Heavy boosters at pad 39A. Everything looking good for launch at 5:56 p.m. Eastern Time, 22:56 UTC. SpaceX's countdown is at T-minus 41 minutes, 37 seconds. For those of you who have watched our coverage of Falcon 9 launches, the countdown is a bit different for the Falcon Heavy. For Falcon 9s, which are launched with a single first stage booster, propellant loading doesn't actually start until T-minus 35 minutes. As we saw today for Falcon Heavy, because there's so much more propellant to be loaded with 3 Falcon booster cores together, the propellant loading begins for the Falcon Heavy at T-minus 50 minutes. So that started 9 minutes ago. Liquid oxygen loading got underway at T-minus 45 minutes. And then coming up at T-minus 35 minutes will be the start of loading of kerosene fuel onto the second stage of the Falcon Heavy rocket out at pad 39A. And then at T-minus 18 minutes 30 seconds, liquid oxygen will begin loading onto the second stage. So it's a staggered propellant loading process for the Falcon Heavy countdown this evening. 40 minutes 30 seconds to go in this evening's countdown. Here are some images of the Falcon Heavy rocket on pad 39A taken over the last couple of days. The Falcon Heavy completed a test firing or static fire test of its 27 main engines last Tuesday on pad 39A. SpaceX rolled the Falcon Heavy back to the hangar for integration with its payload compartment. That payload fairing was moved to encapsulate the 2 U.S. Space Force payloads in an off-site payload processing facility, and then that payload fairing was moved to the hangar at pad 39A for integration with the Falcon Heavy rocket last week. The Falcon Heavy, with its payload fairing, rolled back to pad 39A on Friday, or Saturday morning actually, and was lifted vertical shortly after noon yesterday. So these images from SpaceX on the left show the payload fairing with its U.S. Space Force logo, as well as the mission patch for the USSF-67 mission. That logo is on the payload fairing, and I'll draw your attention to the gray stripe, the gray paint at the bottom of the second stage, at the very bottom of the image on the left here. That's some paint that is used as thermal insulation on the kerosene tank of the second stage. We've mentioned that this mission will take about 6 hours to deliver the payloads to geosynchronous orbit, more than 22,000 miles over the equator. And SpaceX has added this band of gray paint on the outside of the kerosene fuel tank on the second stage to help prevent that fuel from freezing as the rocket coasts through the very cold environment of space for 6 hours until that last critical burn of the second stage engine to set the stage for separation of the 2 payloads on tonight's flight. So with the 5:56 p.m. launch, we don't expect to get confirmation of the final payload deployment and final mission success until sometime after midnight Eastern time. That's about 5 a.m. UTC. The images on the right, on the upper right, show a view from one of our Spaceflight Now cameras at the press set showing the rollout of the Falcon Heavy yesterday morning, and on the lower right, the fully integrated Falcon Heavy on the pad yesterday. That image comes from SpaceX. The countdown is just past 38 minutes until liftoff, so we're now about 3 minutes away from the next major milestone, which will be the start of kerosene fuel loading on the second stage. And here's a look at the countdown timeline that I've been talking about. This chart shows some of the major milestones. We've already passed a couple of these milestones at T-minus 50 minutes with the start of propellant loading at T-minus 45 minutes. Liquid oxygen began pumping onto the 3 Falcon Heavy first stage boosters. Looking ahead, at T-minus 35 minutes will be the kerosene loading on stage 2. At T-minus 18 minutes 30 seconds, the super cold cryogenic liquid oxygen for the second stage will begin flowing into the vehicle. At T-minus 7 minutes, the 27 Merlin engines on the 3 first stage boosters will begin their engine chill down process. This is a thermal conditioning effort to prevent or protect these engines from the thermal shock of liquid oxygen flowing into those engines at engine ignition. The liquid oxygen is chilled down below 200 degrees, minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit, close to oxygen's freezing temperature. This makes this oxygen densified, and it allows SpaceX to cram more molecules of liquid oxygen into the propellant tank. That adds to the performance of the Falcon Heavy rocket during the launch. It also ensures that the rocket has enough reserve propellant to return those 2 side boosters back to Earth for recovery and reuse. At 4.5 minutes before launch, the strongback out at pad 39A, that's the structure just to the right of the Falcon Heavy, will retract to a very slight angle of about 1.5 degrees from the rocket. At T-minus 2 minutes, the rocket should be fully loaded with all propellants. And at that point, the fill and drain valves will be closed. At T-minus 60 seconds, the Falcon Heavy onboard computer will take command of the countdown. And at T-minus 45 seconds, the SpaceX launch director will give their final go for launch. At 20 seconds, the propellant tanks will be pressurized. They'll be brought up to flight pressure. And then engine ignition, that sequence begins at T-minus 6 seconds. If the engines all look healthy, if all 27 engines throttle up to full power, hold down clamps will release at T0 to allow the Falcon Heavy to begin its climb into space.
Stage 2 RP1 load is starting.
And we just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the kerosene loading on stage 2 that we talked about starting at T-minus 35 minutes has indeed begun. So the next phase of the countdown is now underway with loading of propellants onto the second stage of the Falcon Heavy. This is the part of the rocket that will be used for 3 burns tonight to place the U.S. Space Force's new military communications satellite, as well as the LDPE-3A prototype satellite into geosynchronous orbit. SpaceX's countdown just passed T-minus 30 minutes. Everything looks to be on schedule for liftoff at 5:56 p.m. Eastern Time, 22:56 UTC, to begin the USSF-67 mission for the United States Space Force. We're looking live at Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're seeing some of the vapors venting from the strongback, as well as some condensation and frost building up on the boosters, the two side boosters out at pad 39A. This comes from the loading of the cryogenic liquid oxygen several hundred degrees below zero as it's pumped into the boosters on the Falcon Heavy rocket. Ice and frost can build up on the outer skin of those rocket elements, and you can see some of the scorch and soot markings from the previous flights of those two boosters. That gray color is now being covered up with the white frost, so you can see the loading of propellants continues out at pad 39A. 28 minutes, 45 seconds to go. This will mark the 5th flight of a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket, and is actually the first of as many as 5 Falcon Heavy missions SpaceX plans to launch this year. Later in the year, in the March timeframe, currently, as current schedules show, SpaceX plans to launch its next Falcon Heavy with a Viasat broadband communications satellite. That'll be followed in April with the launch of another Space Force mission on the Falcon Heavy. And then in the late spring or summer time frame, SpaceX plans to launch the Jupiter 3 broadband commercial communications satellite for Hughes Network Systems and EchoStar on a Falcon Heavy. And then in October, another Falcon Heavy is set to launch NASA's Psyche asteroid mission. All those flights will depart from pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX's countdown now is at T-minus 25.5 minutes until liftoff of the Falcon Heavy rocket from Launch Complex 39A. We talked about the upcoming Falcon Heavy missions. Again, this is the first of 5 Falcon Heavy launches on SpaceX's schedule for 2023. Let's take a look back at the 4 previous Falcon Heavy launches. The first Falcon Heavy rocket launched back on February the 6th of 2018. That was the inaugural test flight of the Falcon Heavy. They carried a Tesla Roadster as the dummy payload, essentially, into a heliocentric orbit. So it launched that Tesla Roadster automobile away from the Earth on an escape trajectory into solar orbit. That was a successful debut for the Falcon Heavy. And then the Falcon Heavy entered operational service a year and a few months later on April the 11th of 2019. The Falcon Heavy launched with Arabsat 6A. That was a Saudi Arabian commercial communications satellite. 2 months later, June 25th, 2019, the third Falcon Heavy launched. That was the first night launch of a Falcon Heavy with the Space Test Program 2 mission for the U.S. military that carried 24 small satellites into orbit for NASA and the Defense Department. And then most recently, after a gap of more than 3 years, the USSF-44 mission launched on a Falcon Heavy on November the 1st of last year from Pad 39A that carried 2 military satellites into geosynchronous orbit, and it was actually the mission that used the 2 side boosters that are set to fly again on this evening's mission. So the 2 side boosters on the USSF-44 mission came back to Cape Canaveral for landing. They were refurbished, and now they're being reused on tonight's flight for the Space Force. And if all goes according to plan, they'll be reused again on the next Space Force launch on a Falcon Heavy in the April timeframe. You can see it's now golden hour at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, 23 minutes, 20 seconds until liftoff. Approaching sunset in the next 10 to 15 minutes on Florida's Space Coast. Liftoff is scheduled around 10 minutes after sunset local time at Kennedy Space Center. In the next few moments, we expect to see the so-called big vent from the strongback out at Pad 39A. And we're now seeing that big vent underway. That coincides with the end of kerosene loading, kerosene fueling on the second stage. So at this time, the kerosene tank on the second stage should be fully loaded. And now preparations are underway to load liquid oxygen onto stage 2.
Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
did just hear that call from SpaceX Launch Control that RP-1, or Rocket Propellant 1, loading on the second stage is complete. That's the kerosene fuel that will feed the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage for tonight's mission. Rocket Propellant 1 is a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene. T-minus 18 minutes, 10 seconds at this time. Liquid oxygen should be loading into the second stage. We may hear that call from SpaceX Launch Control in the next few moments. It's the final propellant tank to be filled this evening. In parallel with propellant loading, SpaceX is loading cryogenic helium into the vehicle as well. That's stored in high-pressure storage tanks on the Falcon Heavy rocket, on each stage of the rocket. And the helium is used to maintain pressure in the propellant tanks as fuel and oxidizer are consumed in flight. Here's a look at the expected trajectory for the Falcon Heavy after it lifts off from pad 39A tonight. The Falcon Heavy will be heading due east from Kennedy Space Center, targeting an equatorial geosynchronous orbit. And to reach that equatorial orbit, the Falcon Heavy will head out over the Atlantic Ocean. The ground track here is noted with the red line as it heads due east again from Kennedy Space Center. And that's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the second stage liquid oxygen loading is now underway at pad 39A. Again, the Falcon Heavy's two side boosters will be returning to landing zone 1 and 2 at Kennedy Space Center, or at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station rather. Shortly after launch, about 8 minutes after liftoff, is when those two side boosters will come back to Cape Canaveral for landing. The center core stage will be discarded. It will not be recovered out in the Atlantic Ocean. A SpaceX recovery ship is also on station about 900 miles or 1,500 kilometers east of Kennedy Space Center to attempt to retrieve the two fairing halves from the nose cone of the Falcon Heavy. Those fairing halves will be jettisoned a little more than 4 minutes into the flight and will parachute into the sea for recovery. SpaceX hopes to recover and reuse those fairing halves on a future mission as well. Here's a look at an infographic from SpaceX showing the trajectory of the Falcon Heavy as it makes its way into space. You can see some of the maneuvers illustrated here. The flip maneuver by the two side boosters after they jettison from the core stage 2.5 minutes after liftoff. And those two side boosters will make their hypersonic descent back to Cape Canaveral Space Force Station for nearly simultaneous landings at landing zone 1 and 2, which are just next to each other on the Atlantic coastline about 9 miles south of pad 39A, the liftoff point for this flight. And this infographic also shows the continuation of the core stage and the upper stage up into orbit for the USSF 67 mission. And here's a look, if you're not familiar with the geography of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, on this map we've labeled the location of Launch Complex 39A. That's where you've been looking at throughout our coverage this evening, where the Falcon Heavy is awaiting liftoff. And landing zones 1 and 2 are the two concrete landing pads for the Falcon Heavy side boosters located right next to one another down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station.
spacecraft are on internal power.
SpaceX's countdown continues. T-minus 13 minutes and counting. We just heard confirmation from Launch Control over in Firing Room 4 at the Launch Control Center at Kennedy Space Center that the 2 payloads for this mission have now switched to internal power, so they're now in launch configuration, running off their onboard batteries for the climb into space tonight on the Falcon Heavy rocket. These 2 satellites, one is called the CBAS-2 satellite. That's the Space Force's continuous broadcast augmenting SATCOM mission. It follows up on the first such CBAS satellite that launched back in 2018 on an Atlas V rocket. Not much is known about this spacecraft, this mission, other than the Space Force says it provides space-based relay for military data augmenting other military communications satellites. So this satellite provides data relay services for the Space Force. The other payload is the long-duration propulsive ESPA. It's the LDPE-3A mission built by Northrop Grumman. This particular spacecraft is made of a modified payload adapter ring that has its own solar arrays and computers and propulsion on board. There are 5 hosted payloads on this adapter ring, this modified adapter ring on the LDPE-3A mission for the U.S. Space Force's Space Systems Command and the military's Space Rapid Capabilities Office. These payloads will perform experiments and operations for areas such as secure communications, space environment monitoring, and space situational awareness, which is essentially the detection and tracking and monitoring of other objects in space. So that's the type of missions that the Falcon Heavy is set to deliver to space this evening on the USSF-67 mission. The CBAS-2 satellite is riding in the upper position inside the payload fairing of the Falcon Heavy. LDP-3A is down below on the lower berth of the Falcon Heavy payload compartment. Here's a look at the 2 mission patches that we have for tonight's mission. On the left is the SpaceX mission patch for USSF-67, showing an illustration of the Falcon Heavy during launch. On the right is the Space Force mission patch for this USSF-67 launch. That's the logo that's actually on the payload fairing of the rocket out at the pad, awaiting liftoff, now 10.5 minutes away. This view you're looking at now comes from the Kennedy Space Center press site, showing the countdown clock and photographers and news media representatives gathering for viewing tonight's launch about 3 miles away from Pad 39A. It's now sunset on Florida's Space Coast.
Center core RP1 load is complete. PY booster RP1 load is complete.
We're hearing calls now from SpaceX Launch Control that the center core booster for the Falcon Heavy has now received its full load of kerosene fuel, as well as one of the side boosters. Topping off of the other side booster's kerosene tank continues for the next few moments. And liquid oxygen loading will continue on the rocket down until about T-minus 2 minutes. That's when SpaceX will have a fully loaded rocket, Falcon Heavy, on pad 39A awaiting liftoff. The countdown has now passed 6.5 minutes until launch, so chill down of the 27 Merlin Wendy engines is now underway. This is a thermal conditioning process that involves flowing a little bit of a super cold liquid oxygen through the engine compartment on all three booster cores to configure and thermally condition those engines for ignition.
NY booster RP1 load is complete.
And now the third of the three Falcon Heavy boosters is now fully loaded with kerosene fuel.
Tanks are pressing for a strong back retract.
Back retract in progress.
Here's a look at the mission timeline we expect for the Falcon Heavy after liftoff this evening. Now 5 minutes to go. The Stromback is retracting from the Falcon Heavy rocket. Again, the rocket will be heading due east from Kennedy Space Center. It will pass the speed of sound in about a minute. The two side boosters will jettison about 2.5 minutes into the flight. They'll perform their flip maneuvers using cold gas thrusters and begin thrusting back toward Cape Canaveral for landing. Those boost back burns will use 3 of the 9 engines on each side booster.
NY booster LOX load is complete.
The core stage will throttle up at that point to full power and burn till about 4 minutes into the flight, at which point it will jettison to fall uncontrolled into the Atlantic Ocean. It won't be recovered. And then the second stage will take over the mission. The second stage we expect to fire 3 times.
Load is complete.
3 times over 6 hours to inject the 2 U.S. Space Force payloads into geosynchronous orbit. but due to national security concerns and requests from the Space Force, SpaceX will focus on the 2 side boosters as they return to landing. And we expect the upper stage to perform its maneuvers in secret.
Center
and
core
we expect a
lock load
statement
complete.
from a SpaceX later tonight on the outcome of the launch. We're now hearing calls from SpaceX launch control that the liquid oxygen loading on the 3 first stage boosters is now concluding. And then coming up in the next 30 seconds or so, liquid oxygen loading on the second stage should be complete as well. This view we're now seeing live comes from a tracking camera operated by Pete Karstens of Max Q Productions, who is supporting our coverage this evening. Again, if you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button on our stream. That helps us get as many people watching our coverage as possible. We want to bring this likely spectacular Twilight launch to as many people as possible. You can do that by hitting the like button. T-minus 2 minutes and counting.
Stage 2 lock load complete.
Ground gas closeouts.
Falcon Heavy is in startup.
The call that Falcon Heavy is in startup as the countdown passes the T-minus 60-second mark. Everything looking good for liftoff this evening. For the voice of the mission director, give their final go for liftoff. T-minus 20 seconds. T-minus 15. Engine ignition will begin at about T-minus 6 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's engine ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket on a mission for the United States Space Force. Falcon Heavy now 25 seconds into the flight, performing its roll maneuver, heading out due east from Kennedy Space Center. The spectacular view of those 27 engines comes from Pete Karstens of Max Q Productions. T plus 40 seconds. Falcon Heavy continues its twilight climb into space, approaching the speed of sound now, heading east from Kennedy Space Center. 5.1 million pounds of thrust from its 27 Merlin engines. Power and telemetry reported nominal from SpaceX Launch Control. Everything looking good. Falcon Heavy now supersonic. And the Falcon Heavy is now past max Q. That's the period of maximum aerodynamic stress on the rocket. You can see the contrail forming in the wake of the Falcon Heavy's 27 main engines, arcing now east, heading for a geosynchronous orbit with the USSF-67 mission. The 2 side boosters are at full throttle. The center core is operating at partial thrust, conserving propellant because that center core will have to throttle up and burn a little longer than the 2 side boosters on this flight. That throttle up will occur after the burnout and separation of the two side boosters. Shutdown of those two side boosters coming up in about 20 seconds. There's booster engine cutoff. And booster separation. The two Falcon Heavy side boosters have jettisoned from the core stage. They're now beginning their flip maneuvers to head back to Cape Canaveral for recovery. The core stage now throttling up, continuing downrange. And there's the ignition of the two side boosters, 3 engines on each booster firing to propel them back toward Cape Canaveral for landing. Here's a wider view now showing the boosters performing their boost back burns. Core stage continuing downrange. Spectacular views of these two boosters performing their maneuvers to head back to the launch site. 3 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight. Boost back burns are continuing on both boosters. See, the boost back burns are complete, showing one of those boosters firing cold gas thrusters. Those cold gas thrusters are used for attitude control while these boosters are traveling in space. We've heard confirmation now of stage separation, so the core stage of the Falcon Heavy rocket has completed its work. So we heard confirmation of shutdown of the core stage. That core stage has now jettisoned. We're now streaming some views from SpaceX. These views come from onboard cameras on each of the two side boosters. So right now the upper stage of the Falcon Heavy should be firing. However, those mission events will be occurring in secret. We won't get any real-time updates on the progress of the second stage as it heads into orbit with these two USSF-67 payloads for the Space Force. The SpaceX video where you're watching now comes with a bit of a time delay, about 10 to 15 seconds or so. You can see the onboard camera views on each booster is a bit obstructed. Looks like some exhaust residue may have covered up some of those camera lenses. So we're going to switch back to the view from Pete Carson's tracking one of these boosters as it heads back to Earth for landing. Here's a wide shot of the colorful exhaust plume from the Falcon Heavy as it made its way into space this evening. Everything looking good so far. And there's ignition, entry burn, ignition. So 3 of the engines on this booster now firing. You can actually see that booster performing its entry burn in the upper part of this wide-angle view. Both boosters
Side core
appear
entry
to
burn
have
startup.
completed their entry burns. Everything looking good.
PYFTS has saved, and NYFTS has saved.
7 minutes, 10 seconds since liftoff. Less than a minute now remaining until the landing of the two Falcon Heavy side boosters. Again, this view comes from Pete Karstens of Max Q Productions. And there's ignition of the landing burn on one of the two side boosters.
Booster landing burn.
Booster is now passed below the horizon, or below the tree line from our position at Kennedy Space Center. So we're going to switch over to SpaceX.
Stage 2 is on thermal guidance.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
Booster landing leg deploy.
And there's landing. Booster landing at landing zones 1 and 2.
Both Falcons have landed.
That confirms both Falcon boosters have landed at landing zones 1 and 2. So these boosters have made their second flights to space this evening. Following an inaugural flight back in November, these boosters will be reused coming up later this spring on the next Space Force mission on the Falcon Heavy rocket, USSF-52. Again, SpaceX, a focused coverage on the recovery of the first two of the two side boosters of the Falcon Heavy rocket.
Insertion.
We are, though, hearing some verbal updates from SpaceX Launch Control, some audio updates on the upper stage's progress. So we've heard confirmation that the upper stage has actually completed its first of 3 burns on tonight's mission and has now entered a nominal parking orbit. So a good indication that the Falcon Heavy's upper stage has so far done its job, but 6 hours to go now until the recovery of the deployment of the 2 payloads on the Falcon Heavy rocket in geosynchronous orbit. The shot now of Launch Complex 39A, an empty pad. You can see that Strongback has retracted at liftoff to an angle of about 45 degrees. That's normal. It'll stay there until SpaceX teams get back into the pad and begin safing and securing the pad for the next launch from pad 39A. Now 11 minutes since the launch of the USSF-67 mission on a Falcon Heavy rocket. Here's another shot of the empty pad at Launch Complex 39A. See some venting of gaseous oxygen from the Strongback. That's normal. That's a normal thing we see after every Falcon launch here at Cape Canaveral and at Kennedy Space Center. And here's a look at the exhaust plume lit up by the sun. This exhaust plume from the Falcon Heavy's engines was quite a sight to see in our video coverage. So if you missed it, you can rewind our coverage to see what you may have missed as the Falcon Heavy made its way into space. This was the 5th flight of a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket. You see that, again, the exhaust plume lit up in blues and whites and purples and reds in the upper atmosphere as the sun is sinking farther below the horizon on Florida Space Coast. The sun's still shining, though, in the upper atmosphere 12 minutes since the launch. So just to recap, the Falcon Heavy took off from Launch Complex 39A at 5:56 p.m. Eastern Time, or 22:56 UTC. It arced out on a trajectory due east from Kennedy Space Center. We saw the two side boosters shut down their engines and detach from the core stage. About 2.5 minutes after liftoff, those two side boosters made their way to successful landing back at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, settling onto landing zones 1 and 2 about 8 minutes after liftoff. Those boosters are designated booster 1064 and 1065. They have flown once before. Today was their second flight, and the boosters will make at least one more flight on a future Falcon Heavy mission coming up in the April timeframe on the next Space Force mission on a Falcon Heavy. That's called USSF 52. The center core stage, booster 1070, was expended on this mission. It made a crash landing out in the Atlantic Ocean. And we also heard some verbal confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the upper stage of the Falcon Heavy completed the first burn of its roll on tonight's flight. So the Falcon Heavy has placed the two USSF 67 payloads, the CBAS-2 communications satellite, and the LDPE-3A rideshare spacecraft into a parking orbit. But there's still nearly 6 hours of work to do by the upper stage. We expect 2 more firings by its single engine tonight, culminating in the deployment of the 2 payloads into geosynchronous orbit a little after midnight Eastern Time, 5 a.m. UTC. The next burn by the upper stage is expected to place these 2 spacecraft into an egg-shaped or elliptical transfer orbit. Right now it's in a circular low orbit just a couple hundred miles above the Earth. The next burn will place the satellites into this higher transfer orbit with a apogee or high point near the final altitude that they'll be deployed in, more than 20,000 miles above the Earth. And then the rocket will coast up through the Van Allen radiation belts over the course of several hours, and then will reignite its engine a final time, around 6 hours after launch, to circularize the orbit at 22,000 miles, or about 36,000 kilometers over the equator. So that final burn will not only raise the low point of the orbit, or perigee of the orbit, from just above the atmosphere up to geosynchronous altitude, will also reshape the orbit, reduce its inclination to fly directly over the equator, and then the 2 satellites will be released one at a time. CBAS-2, the communications satellite, will be deployed first, followed by the LDPE-3A rideshare spacecraft a few minutes later. Now, 18 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Here's a look ahead at some of the launches we'll be covering over the next couple of weeks. SpaceX has their next mission scheduled on Wednesday, January the 18th. That'll be the launch of a Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Complex 40 down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, just a few miles away from where we saw the Falcon Heavy liftoff from this evening. That will carry the GPS-3 SV06 mission to orbit for the U.S. Space Force. That's a GPS navigation satellite built by Lockheed Martin. That's already integrated with the Falcon 9 rocket at Pad 40 inside the hangar. And SpaceX will roll the Falcon 9 rocket to the pad in the coming days to prepare for that launch on January the 18th, Wednesday. The launch window opens at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, or noon, 12 p.m. UTC, and runs for 36 minutes. That will again be a twilight launch, a pre-dawn launch, a launch at dawn rather, for the Falcon 9 rocket. So we could see some spectacular imagery again on Wednesday morning for the Falcon 9 launch with the GPS 3 SV06 mission. The next day, on Thursday, another Falcon 9 rocket is set to go from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with the next batch of 51 Starlink internet satellites. This mission is known as Starlink 2-4. It's been delayed now nearly a week and a half to wait for some improved weather conditions. If you've been watching the news, you'll know that there's been some high winds, some flooding rains affecting California throughout the month of January. And that's also affecting some of the sea conditions downrange for recovery of the Falcon 9 booster. So SpaceX is hoping for improved conditions next week for the launch of the Starlink 2-4 mission on Thursday, January the 19th. Later in the month, Rocket Lab will make another attempt to launch their first mission from U.S. soil. That mission is set to launch on January the 23rd from Wallops Island, Virginia. That's Rocket Lab's new launch complex on Virginia's eastern shore. The launch attempt last month for this mission was delayed, and Rocket Lab hopes to try again on January the 23rd around 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 2300 UTC for that launch attempt. And then later in the month, on January the 24th U.S. time, January the 25th Japanese time, a Japanese government reconnaissance satellite, a radar surveillance satellite, is set to launch from the Tanegashima Space Center in Japan. So that's a look ahead at some of the launches we'll be covering over the next few days and couple of weeks. More missions are on the books, though. Later this month, we expect another Starlink launch from Florida before the end of the month as well, at least one more. We don't have a confirmed date for that, but you can pencil that in for late January. This view again from Kennedy Space Center shows the evolving exhaust plume being blown by the upper level winds in the upper atmosphere. Again, that plume is continuing to catch the last rays of sunlight after sunset on Florida's Space Coast. The sun's still shining in the upper atmosphere, illuminating some of the ice crystals that have formed from the exhaust left behind by the Falcon Heavy rocket. With that, we're going to conclude our live coverage, our live broadcast from Kennedy Space Center. We'll have further updates in our Mission Status Center over the course of the next few hours. We'll also have confirmation very late tonight, likely after midnight Eastern Time, of the conclusion of the Falcon Heavy mission. We expect to get a statement or update from SpaceX and from the Space Force once the final maneuver and spacecraft deployment events are complete to confirm a successful outcome for this mission. But the Falcon Heavy is off to a good start on its 5th flight, the first of 5 Falcon Heavy flights also planned in 2023. So with that, we're going to again wrap up our coverage. Thanks for joining us. We hope you'll join us on Wednesday. That'll be our next scheduled live broadcast for the Falcon 9 launch with the next GPS navigation satellite. If you want to support our coverage, you can do that by hitting the join button on our YouTube stream. If you join our YouTube channel, become a member, you can gain access to exclusive bonus members-only video features that we have on our YouTube channel, and you'll be helping us continue our coverage and expand our coverage and keep up with the busy pace of launches on Florida Space Coast this year. Up to 87 launches are on the books this year from Cape Canaveral on Kennedy Space Center. This was launch number 3 of the year. Launch number 4 coming up on Wednesday. We'll see you then. And again, I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of Spaceflight Now, signing off. Thanks for joining us. I want to give a big thank you to Stephen Young, providing video production support at Kennedy Space Center, as well as Pete Karstens of MaxQ Productions, who operated a tracking camera for us, providing some of those really dazzling video views of tonight's launch. So have a great night. We'll see you in a few days.